Hey everyone, I'm Chantel Jennings. Welcome to ESPN.com's Kickoff Show. This is a really cool platform that we use on Spreecast. It gives you direct access to the writers who are on campus at the games in the press conference every week. Today we have Dinich, Jake Trotter, and Andrea Adelson with me. And it's really cool because you can talk to them in real time. If you have questions, put them in at the bottom of the screen. We save a little bit of time each show to get those questions in. And as people are getting on, we're going to give you a little bit of time to get those questions in. They were starting with a huge matchup. Obviously, FSU Notre Dame has dominated the storylines this week. Andrea, we're going to start with you. Obviously, for Florida State, the Jameis Winston stuff, it hasn't been a distraction this year. They've stayed away from that pretty well. Could it kind of be a trap for them this weekend, though? Andrea, can you hear me?
Andrea, I think Chantel was asking if you think that this could be a trap game for Florida State, and then kind of what this game means for both teams in terms of the playoff.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a huge game for Florida State. I think it's a playoff elimination game for both teams. And, you know, the big question is whether or not all these distractions around Jameis Winston are finally going to have an impact. This guy has got this laser-like ability to focus in on football. All of this outside noise, or clutter, as Jimbo Fisher likes to say, it means nothing to him. And even last week when he was in the news, he goes out and he has a great game against Syracuse. He completed 70% of his passes, 300 yards. It's like nothing ever phases this guy. And I think it's going to continue to be that way. This Florida State team is so close-knit. They've kind of taken this us against the world mentality and rallied around each other. And a big reason why is because they all believe in Jameis Winston. And if anybody doubts that, just go back and listen to what Jimbo Fisher said during his press conference earlier this week. Completely adamant in his defense of Jameis, left no room for any questions at all. They're all in behind Jameis Winston, and I think he's going to have a big game on Saturday.
Well, Andrea, I have to disagree with you when you say that this is a playoff elimination game for both teams. I think it is an elimination game for Florida State, but I do think that Notre Dame still has enough of a schedule going down that I don't think the selection committee would necessarily count them out after a road loss to a top 5 team, the defending national champs, because if you look at their schedule, at Notre Dame's schedule, they still have to go on the road against Arizona State, on the road at the end of the season at USC, and they did play Stanford. They beat Stanford. So even with one loss on the road at Florida State, I still think that the rest of their schedule could still give them an impressive enough playoff resume should they win out, regardless of what happens in Tallahassee.
Okay, but is it a good thing that Notre Dame's schedule is Pac-12 heavy when all of a sudden people are starting to have doubts about the Pac-12? Because now people are wondering, is this conference as strong as we thought it was because everybody's beating up on each other? And so my take on that is I think because Notre Dame isn't in a conference, I think they may end up being hurt at some point. I also think the committee may look at Florida State as the defending champions. If it's a close loss, if Oklahoma State is still good, if Clemson remains in the top 25, if Florida is somehow better, and look at that Florida State schedule and start thinking, okay, maybe they have some value here. I don't necessarily think Notre Dame may get a nod over a team from a conference. I think no conference affiliation may hurt Notre Dame.
All right, sorry everyone for the technical errors. Hopefully I'm back for good and we don't have to deal with any of those anymore. Before we move on to a few other games that are obviously going to affect Florida State's chances and Notre Dame's chances, Andrea, I want to send you a question from one of our viewers. Mike Crook is curious kind of about the media coverage of Florida State. He says, what's your take on how the media seems to be going after FSU for every little thing? Do you feel they report on other universities' shortcomings, or does it seem they focus on FSU too much, Andrea?
Well, as somebody who has a degree from the University of Florida, I can confidently say that Florida State is not the only school that's been in the crosshairs of the national media. I think that the reason Florida State fans seem to be thinking this is because Jameis Winston himself keeps finding himself in trouble. I don't think we're making any of this stuff up. Jameis is the one who has been under investigation for an alleged sexual assault. He's the one who stole soda. He's the one who stole crab legs. We could keep going, but the fact remains, when you're the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback at the number one school in the country, there is going to be increased scrutiny. That all comes with the territory. And I know Jimbo Fisher was asked earlier this week if he felt there was a media witch hunt going on. I just think we're trying to report the facts, and the facts remain, Jameis has gotten into some trouble. Johnny Manziel can also attest to the fact that it's hard being under the scrutiny when you win a Heisman. And he may not have gotten into as much trouble as Jameis, but boy, we reported a lot on on Johnny Manziel at this point last year, so I don't really think that the media is going after Florida State. I just think it may be magnified a little bit because of where they are and who Jameis is.
I also have a hard time looking at it as a witch hunt when you're jumping on a table in a room of people who have camera phones and access to Twitter. It's not like he's doing this stuff in the dark. He's doing it in the wide open where there's security cameras and people with iPhones, and it's just not very smart. But let's move on from Florida State, Notre Dame. Obviously, we'll be able to get to that game and if anyone has any more questions. But let's move over to the Big 12. Jake, there are a lot of good matchups there this weekend, some that could impact FSU's chances at the college football playoff. Jake, 3 big matchups. Which one is the most intriguing to you?
They're all very intriguing, Chantel, in their own way. Let's start with Oklahoma State TCU just in the context of Florida State, because the Seminoles right now, their best win is probably the Cowboys, and Oklahoma State may be 5-1 right now, but if they continue to play the way that they have, they could very easily finish this year 5-7. This is a team that has a bunch of question marks, have not been very good on the offensive line. They've had the quarterback change from J.W. Walsh to Dax Garman since that opener against Florida State. We're getting ready to find out a lot about the Cowboys this weekend as they go to TCU. But if that's Florida State's best win, I would be very concerned if I were a Seminole fan. I think Florida State would have to go undefeated to make the playoffs.
Well, as of right now, I think that Florida State is probably the team people are most convinced is going to make the 4-team playoff because of the way their schedule sets up. I would think that most people are probably picking them to beat Notre Dame at home and then win out and win the ACC championship. But if they lose to Notre Dame, there's not, as of right now, another ranked team on their schedule. And Andrea could probably attest to this, that the way the Coastal Division is looking right now, I don't know that there's going to be a ranked team from the Coastal lining up against Florida State in the ACC championship game. So they absolutely have to win out in order to make that 4-team playoff, but there's no way I could see the committee leaving out an undefeated Florida State team. But going back to the Big 12 talk, I love this matchup in Morgantown between Baylor and West Virginia. I think that's going to be a real tough game for Baylor, and I think we're going to see the scoreboards light up again. What about you, Jake?
Yeah, this is a huge weekend in the Big 12. You have 3 marquee matchups. We already talked about TCU, Oklahoma State, and I'm picking the underdog in the other 2. I picked West Virginia to beat Baylor, and I picked K-State to beat Oklahoma for some big-time chaos in the league. I think West Virginia matches up actually pretty well with Baylor. They've been very close to winning against Alabama and Oklahoma earlier this year. They can score, and as TCU proved last week, Baylor can be scored upon. So this is a very dangerous game for Baylor, and one they're probably going to have to win to make the playoff because, like we've said with Florida State, Baylor's non-conference schedule is not very good. SMU, Northwestern State, and Buffalo. That's not going to get it done, I think, in the eyes of the playoff committee.
All right, well, let's bring it over to another conference, the Pac-12. Heather, I'm going to throw this one to you. It's from Eric Fisher. It's a viewer question. He said, I've noticed that the strength of the Pac-12 is being questioned more and more. Doesn't actually have a question mark in here, but I'll turn it into a question for him. Heather, what do you think about the strength of the Pac-12? Stanford's defense is being questioned, even though it's statistically the best in the country. What are your thoughts right now on the depth and the strength of the Pac-12 conference?
Well, I still think it's very good, and that was a point that I actually wanted to make earlier because Andrea was the one who threw it out there as a question mark. I realized that UCLA is not the team a lot of us probably thought it was going to be heading into this season, and Oregon, after it lost, fell off the radar a little bit. But I tell you what, if you're going to give the SEC credit for beating up on each other, then you have to give the credit to the Big 12 as well. I mean, clearly I agree that the SEC West is the best division in college football, but there's depth in the Pac-12. There are some very good teams and very good quarterbacks that are playing there right now, and I still think that with a 9-game schedule and a league title, even a 2-loss Pac-12 champ has a very good shot at making the playoff.
All right, we're going to go to another viewer question right now, too. We're bringing it back to the Big 12. We're all over it today. It's fine. Keegan Renault, he's curious. Jake, Oklahoma's mental errors haven't killed them yet, but do you think that could bite them this weekend?
I do. I'm picking Kansas State this weekend. Oklahoma has not been impressive the last 2 weeks, and to me it starts with Trevor Knight in the offense. They went 15 straight possessions from TCU to Texas and scored a single field goal, and they're playing a defense in Kansas State that completely shut down Auburn earlier this year and would have won the game had they not missed 3 field goals and turned the ball over at the 2-yard line. So I think this is a very difficult matchup for Oklahoma. Kansas State and Bill Snyder coming off the off week. I don't feel comfortable about anybody going up against Bill Snyder with him coming off an extra week to prepare. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Kansas State and a very dangerous game for the Sooners.
All right, well, let's take it out to every conference right now. I'm curious, we're at the midway point in the season right now. So either in a good way or a bad way, is there any team right now that is absolutely not the team that you thought it would be going into week 8 of the season? Andrea?
Well, if we're talking about the ACC, it's got to be Virginia. Heather mentioned UCLA earlier, and Virginia probably should have won that game given the way that they played, and that kind of set the tone for their season. They're 4-2. Doubling their win total from a year ago, and right now they're atop the Coastal Division at 2-0. I don't think anybody anticipated that. They were picked to finish last. But nationally, it's got to be Mississippi State. Nobody had them in the top 25 to start the year. That's been the hands-down biggest surprise, I think, out of any team in the entire country.
What do you think, Heather?
I think the entire state of Mississippi has been probably the biggest surprise. But I would say South Carolina also has been a huge surprise in, obviously, a not-so-flattering way. I think a lot of people had much higher expectations, including Steve Spurrier for that team this year, and they fell pretty far pretty fast.
Jake?
Well, I agree with Heather. Mississippi and Mississippi State have been the big surprises in college football. In the Big 12, it's been TCU. I mean, this is a team that everybody was waiting to arrive in the Big 12. They finally have this year. Already beat Oklahoma. And even though they lost to Baylor, I think they proved that they could play with just about anyone in the country. They're very much in the thick of the Big 12 race and possibly a playoff spot with a little bit of help.
All right, well, we talked a little bit about Mississippi. We have a viewer question from Trevor Calkins. Let's bring it back to Mississippi then. He's curious if Mississippi State and Ole Miss both run the table going into the Egg Bowl, could the loser of that team still have a shot at getting into the playoff, even though one team would not win the SEC? Heather, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I would not count that out. I think that even if Georgia, and right now ESPN's FPI gives Georgia the best chance to win the whole conference, and that's because of the way the rest of Georgia's, how favorable the rest of Georgia's schedule looks. Even if Georgia wins, I would still give consideration to the loser, or the winner or the loser of that game. Whichever team has one loss, whichever team looks better, still has a chance to me to get into the 4-team playoff. I think that there's no reason to think that 2 teams from the same conference can't get into this inaugural playoff. And if there's some talk out there, people seem to think that the selection committee members are under pressure to put in 4 conference champions, and they're not. I really believe that this group of people wants to get the 4 best teams, regardless of what conferences they're representing.
Heather, don't you think, though, because it's the first year that they may feel that pressure to get conference champions in? Because they've said that's going to be a criteria. And now they may be setting a precedent if they do get 2 teams in from the same conference that people may not be happy about, especially because there's 5 Power 5 conferences and only 4 spots. So automatically 1 conference is going to be left out. Maybe 2 will be left out. I'm just curious about what you think about that, because it could set a precedent here down the road.
Well, it will set a precedent down the road, and maybe the precedent that they want to set is, hey, we don't care about equal opportunity for the playoff. We care about getting the 4 best teams, whoever they are. And you're right. Not only might there's five Power 5, but don't forget about Notre Dame as well. So you might have the ACC champ, or not if Florida State loses. Let's say you might have Notre Dame. You might have Michigan State if they win out. You might have the SEC champ. You might have the Pac-12 champ. And maybe if all this chaos breaks loose in the Big 12, like Jake's talking about, if you read his picks, maybe nobody from the Big 12 is going to make it. So I think that there are a lot of different scenarios, and I just think that it's way too early to assume that these guys wouldn't put 2 teams from the same conference in, especially if they're the most deserving. And right now, the SEC West, that state of Mississippi, is making a great case for it. Especially if, like I said, Georgia goes on to win the SEC like FPI predicts, and then you've got one of those Mississippi teams still hanging out there. I think that the SEC would have a great shot.
All right, well, let's move on to the lightning round. This is how we end every single show. It's 3 questions. Each of our panelists has about 15 to 20 seconds to answer both. I want to go back to some mid-season stuff since we didn't touch on it as much as I would have liked to. But mid-season MVP, go. Andrea, who's yours?
I think you have to go with Dak Prescott. If you look back at the last game that he played in, I'm sure that there were some throws that he would have probably liked to have back, but he was clutch. 2 of his 3 touchdowns came on 3rd downs, and he's been a difference maker for that team.
I agree with both Andrea and HT. Dak Prescott MVP the midseason.
All right, second question. Let's look at the top 4 right now. What
Sorry,
team
Jake,
in the
it's
top
got to be
4
Baylor
at week 8 in the season is not going to be there at the end of the year? Andrea?
Yeah, I picked West Virginia to win, so I guess I would have to agree with you.
Okay, I'm gonna go with something different here because you guys both said Baylor, even though that's a natural choice considering the defense that they haven't played. I'm gonna go with Mississippi State because I'm gonna pick Ole Miss because I like their defense better, and to me, that's gonna be the difference in the Egg Bowl.
I thought you were going to say Florida State, Heather.
I'm picking the Noles this weekend.
All right. That's fair. That's fair. All right, last question of the lightning round is how we end every single show. If football fans are only watching one game this weekend, and I don't recommend that, but if they're only watching one game this weekend, which game should it be and why? Andrea?
Got to be Florida State, Notre Dame, 2 top 5 teams. Game day is going to be there. It's, I think,
yeah, Andrea, one game
a playoff
and why?
elimination game. I know Heather disagrees, but I think it will damage the losers' chances of getting into a playoff. Maybe Florida State more so, but 2 really good quarterbacks to watch too. I know Jameis is getting a lot of grief off the field, but he's still really having a terrific year and worth watching as a player. So that's my pick.
I agree with Andrea. I know, shocker. We agree. We're on the same page. But I agree. To me, it's the game with the biggest playoff implications. More so, though, I think, for Florida State than for Notre Dame.
Florida State, Notre Dame nationally, but I have a huge problem because I got 2 11 o'clock games that are massive in the Big 12, Baylor, West Virginia, and Oklahoma, Kansas State. I'm going to have to be going back and forth. I requested in the OU press box to sit next to a TV so I can pay attention to both games, so maybe that'll help.
Well, I request a lot of people have more than one game going on this weekend. I'll be covering 2 games, and your ESPN.com writers will be out at all of the games this weekend, so make sure you keep it here for your football